Some stories are so dark they challenge everything we believe about justice, about humanity, about the systems we trust to protect the innocent. Before we begin tonight's file, I need to be direct with you. This is a true story. Every word of what I'm about to tell you happened, and because of the nature of these events, I'll be omitting certain graphic details to comply with content policies. But make no mistake, what remains is more than enough to disturb you, to anger you, and perhaps to change how you see the world. This is the Midnight File, and I'm Julian Cross. If you're new here, welcome to a channel that doesn't look away from the darkness. We're a small but growing community, trying to reach our first 100 subscribers, and I'd be honored if you'd join us. Hit that subscribe button. And if this story affects you the way I know it will, give us a like. We're aiming for 50 likes on this video, a small number, but it means everything to a new channel trying to find its voice in the vastness of the internet. And please leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories travel, what corners of the world they reach. Are you listening in New York, London, São Paulo, Tokyo? Tell me. Because stories like this one, they belong to all of us, as warnings, as lessons, as mirrors, reflecting what we'd rather not see. Tonight, we open a file that should never have been closed, a file that represents not just the actions of one man, but the failure of entire systems, entire nations, entire societies to protect their most vulnerable. This is the story of Pedro Alonso López, a name you may not know but should. They called him the Monster of the Andes, and when you hear what he did, when you learn how many lives he took, and when you discover what happened after he was caught, you'll understand why this case stands as one of the darkest chapters in criminal history. So dim the lights. Find somewhere comfortable, because for the next hour I'm taking you on a journey through Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru in the 1970s and 1980s, through forgotten marketplaces and mountain villages, through police stations and prison cells, through a landscape where children disappeared like smoke, and where the monster who took them walked free not once, but twice. This is the file that keeps me awake at night, and after tonight it might keep you awake too. October 8, 1948, Santa Isabel, Colombia. A small town cradled by mountains, where poverty runs as deep as the valleys and violence is as common as rain. On this day, a boy is born into circumstances that would have challenged anyone. His name is Pedro Alonso López. His mother, a sex worker struggling to feed 13 children. His father, absent. The world he enters is already marked by suffering, already scarred by the kind of desperation that turns people into ghosts long before they die. I tell you this not to excuse what comes next. Understanding is not forgiveness, context is not absolution. But if we're going to make sense of how one human being could become responsible for what Lopez would later confess to, over 300 deaths, mostly young girls between the ages of 8 and 12, then we need to see where it all began. By most accounts, Lopez's childhood was a descent into darkness from the very start. At age 8, he was expelled from home. The reason varies depending on which version of his story you believe. Some reports say he was caught engaging in inappropriate behavior with his younger sister, and his mother, exhausted, overwhelmed, unable to cope, threw him out. Other versions suggest he ran away, unable to bear the chaos of a household with too many children, and not enough of anything else. What happened next shaped everything that followed. In Bogotá, the capital city, there existed a population of street children known as gamines. These were boys and girls who lived in the shadows of the city, sleeping in doorways, begging for coins, stealing food to survive. They were invisible to most people who passed them, just another sad reality of urban poverty, easy to ignore, easier to forget. Pedro López became one of these children, and in the streets he learned that the world was a place of predators and prey. According to López's own later testimony, an adult man approached him during those early days on the street. The man offered food, offered shelter, offered kindness, and López, desperate and alone, followed him. What happened in that man's home is something I won't detail here, but it was a violation that López would later describe as the moment his childhood ended. He was used repeatedly by someone who should have protected him. It's easy to draw a straight line from victim to perpetrator, to say that what was done to López turned him into what he became. But that line is too simple. Thousands of children suffer similar fates and don't become what he became. The trauma may have planted seeds, but Lopez chose to water them. By his teenage years, Lopez was addicted to bazuco, a crude form of cocaine paste that was destroying a generation of poor Colombian youth. It was cheap, devastating, and everywhere. He survived by stealing, by whatever means he could manage in a city that had already forgotten he existed. And then, in 1969, at age 21, Lopez was arrested for stealing a car. He was sent to La Modelo prison in Bogotá, a place with a reputation for brutality. Within 48 hours of his arrival, Lopez was attacked by 4 inmates. The assault was violent and prolonged. Rather than reporting what had happened to him, Lopez made a different choice. Over the following 2 weeks, he fashioned a crude weapon. Reports vary, but most accounts describe it as a sharpened piece of metal or a makeshift blade. And he tracked down 3 of the 4 men who had hurt him. He ended their lives, all 3 of them. When prison authorities investigated, they ruled the deaths as self-defense, a prisoner protecting himself from attackers. It's one of the few times in Lopez's life where the system gave him something resembling understanding, but they still added 2 years to his sentence for the violence. Think about that for a moment. At 21 years old, Pedro Lopez had already taken 3 lives, and the authorities called it justified. They didn't see a serial offender in the making. They saw a victim fighting back. They saw survival. They didn't see what was coming. 1978. Lopez is released from La Modelo prison after serving his sentence. He's nearly 30 years old. He's been shaped by abandonment, by violation, by years in a system that teaches you that violence is the only language that matters. And he walks out of those prison gates into a world that still doesn't care whether he lives or dies. But something has changed in him, something fundamental. During his imprisonment, during those years of isolation and rage, Lopez developed what he would later describe as a mission. He had decided who deserved to suffer. He had decided who would pay for what had been done to him. And so began the most prolific series of crimes in South American history. Lopez started in Peru, moving through the mountainous regions and small towns of the Ayacucho area. He targeted girls, always between the ages of 8 and 12, always from the poorest families or from indigenous communities. He later claimed to have taken the lives of over 100 victims in Peru alone during the late 1970s. Think about that number. Over 100, in a span of just a few years, and almost no one noticed. How is that possible? How does someone take 100 lives without the world paying attention? The answer is as simple as it is devastating. Because the victims were invisible long before they disappeared. These were street children, indigenous girls from communities that barely appeared on official maps, daughters of families so poor that when a child vanished, they had no resources to search, no connections to pressure police, no voice loud enough to be heard over the din of everyday tragedy. Lopez knew this. He exploited it with calculated precision. His method was consistent. He would approach girls in marketplaces or on village streets, offering money, offering candy, offering promises of work or food. To a child who had nothing, these offers weren't suspicious. They were hope. And once he had isolated them, once he had led them away from witnesses and safety, Lopez would reveal his true nature. I won't detail what happened next, but I will tell you that Lopez later described his actions with a chilling matter-of-factness that suggested no remorse, no recognition of the humanity he was destroying. To him, these children were objects, means to an end, vessels for his rage. And he kept a count, like a hunter marking trophies. He knew exactly how many lives he had taken. In one of the most extraordinary moments of his criminal career, Lopez was nearly stopped by justice. Not state justice, but something older and more direct. Indigenous communities in the Ayacucho region had noticed the pattern of disappearances. When Lopez attempted to take a 9-year-old girl from a village, the community was ready. They caught him. They beat him. And, according to various accounts, they buried him up to his neck in the ground, preparing to let nature exact its own punishment. Some versions of this story say they poured syrup over his head, intending to let insects finish what they had started. Whether this detail is true or embellished, the core fact remains: this community was ready to execute their own form of justice. But an American missionary intervened, convinced the tribe to show mercy, convinced them to turn Lopez over to the police instead. The Peruvian authorities arrested Lopez. They had him in custody. They had a confession from the community about what he'd tried to do. They had everything they needed to investigate whether this man might be connected to the dozens of missing girls from the region. Instead, they deported him. They simply sent him across the border into Colombia and told him not to come back. No charges, no investigation, no follow-up, just leave. And Lopez did leave. But he didn't go back to Colombia to retire. He went to Ecuador. Between 1979 and 1980, Ecuador became Lopez's primary hunting ground. He would later claim that he preferred Ecuadorian victims because, in his words, they are more gentle and trusting, more innocent. The statement is sickening not just for what it reveals about his mindset, but for the cold calculation behind it. He wasn't choosing victims at random. He was shopping for the qualities that would make them easier to manipulate, easier to harm. During this period, Lopez claimed to have taken the lives of over 200 girls in Ecuador alone. If you do the mathematics, that's an average of 3 victims per week for over a year. 3 per week. The mind struggles to process numbers like that. Each one was a child, with a name, with a family, with dreams about what their life might become. Each one was a universe of potential snuffed out before it could shine. But to the authorities in Ecuador, these weren't individual tragedies. They were statistics, if they were anything at all. When families reported missing daughters, police attributed the disappearances to human trafficking networks. It was a convenient explanation. Trafficking was a known problem in the region. It was easier to file a report under trafficking than to consider the alternative, that a single predator was hunting children with systematic efficiency. This misidentification would prove catastrophic. While police looked for trafficking rings and criminal networks, Lopez continued his rampage unimpeded. He moved through market towns and villages like a shadow, always hunting, always watching for the next opportunity. If you're watching this and feeling angry, feeling that tightness in your chest that comes from injustice, good. Hold on to that, because it gets worse. And if this story is affecting you, if you're realizing that these systems failed on every level, then share this video. Send it to someone who needs to understand how vulnerable populations can be ignored by the very institutions meant to protect them. These stories matter. These names matter. And the only way we honor the victims is by refusing to look away. March 1980, Ambato, Ecuador. A market town nestled in the Andean highlands, where vendors sell vegetables and textiles in Plaza Rosa, where life moves at the pace it has for centuries. On this day, everything changes. A woman named Carlina Poveda is at the market with her 12-year-old daughter, Maria Romana. It's an ordinary day. They're shopping, navigating the crowds, perhaps planning what to cook for dinner. Maria wanders a short distance away, drawn by something at another stall. And then Carlina sees a man approaching her daughter, sees him speaking to Maria, sees him reaching out trying to lead her away, every parent's nightmare crystallizing in a single moment. Carlina doesn't hesitate. She rushes forward, shouting, grabbing her daughter. Nearby merchants hear the commotion and converge. The man tries to flee, but the market vendors tackle him, hold him down, pin him to the ground until police arrive. The man's name is Pedro Alonso López, and Carlina Poveda has just ended his reign of terror, though she doesn't know it yet. She only knows she saved her daughter. She doesn't know she's saved countless others who would have come after. Lopez is arrested and taken to police headquarters in Ambato. Initially, he refuses to cooperate with interrogators. He's been arrested before, deported before. He knows the system, he gives them nothing. But the Ecuadorian police have a weapon Lopez doesn't expect: patience and deception. Police Captain Pastor Cordova Gudino volunteers for an undercover operation. He poses as a fellow criminal, arranges to be placed in Lopez's cell, and over 27 days, slowly builds trust with the prisoner. He presents himself as someone who understands, someone who doesn't judge, someone who admires strength and cunning. And Lopez, perhaps starved for recognition, perhaps arrogant enough to believe he's smarter than everyone around him, begins to talk. First in hints, then in details. Then in full confessions that leave even Cordova, a man trained to keep his composure, struggling to maintain his cover. Lopez boasts about his activities. He claims to have ended the lives of over 200 girls in Ecuador, some tens in Peru, many more in Colombia. The numbers pour out of him like he's reciting baseball statistics, like he's proud of the count. When Cordova reports what he's learned, investigators are skeptical. Over 200, in Ecuador alone. It seems impossible. It seems like the fantasy of a disturbed man seeking attention. And then the rains come. April 1980. Flash flooding in the mountains near Ambato. The kind of deluge that transforms dry riverbeds into torrents, that reshapes landscapes overnight, that unearths what was meant to stay buried. Local residents discover remains, small skeletons, scattered by the water, clearly victims of violence. The police make the connection. They bring Lopez out of his cell and ask him to show them where he buried his victims. And Lopez agrees readily, almost eagerly. What follows is one of the most grim operations in the history of South American law enforcement. Over the course of several days, Lopez leads investigators through forests and hillsides near Ambato. He points out locations with the casual ease of someone giving directions to a restaurant. There, he says, and there. 3 more over that ridge, 4 near that tree line. The police director, Victor Lascaño, would later recount that Lopez cooperated fully in those early days, leading them to 3 or 4 sites daily. The remains they discover confirm everything. 53 bodies, girls aged 8 to 13, all buried in shallow graves, some arranged in ways that suggested Lopez had returned to the sites multiple times. Each discovery is a family's worst nightmare confirmed. Each small skeleton is a daughter who left home one morning and never came back. Each one is a search that ended not in reunion, but in devastating closure. The remains tell their own stories. Forensic investigators piece together final moments from positioning, from trauma patterns, from the evidence of violence that even decomposition cannot erase. But I won't detail those findings here. Some information serves only to traumatize, not to inform. What matters is this: Lopez's confessions are proven true. He is not exaggerating. If anything, the investigators begin to suspect he might be understating his crimes. Eventually, Lopez grows tired of the process, stops cooperating, refuses to lead them to more sites. But by then they have enough, more than enough. 53 confirmed victims in Ecuador. Confessions to over 200 in that country alone. Admissions of additional crimes in Peru and Colombia that may never be fully investigated. The case against Pedro Alonso López is overwhelming. The question now becomes, what will justice look like? And that's where this story transforms from a tale of criminal horror into an indictment of systemic failure. If you're still with me, thank you. I know this isn't easy to hear. But if stories like this matter to you, if you believe in remembering the forgotten and holding systems accountable, then subscribe to this channel. We're building something here, a community that doesn't look away, that asks hard questions, that refuses to let these stories disappear. Hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it means everything. July 31st, 1981. Approximately 16 months after his arrest, Pedro Alonso López pleads guilty to 110 confirmed cases. The trial is swift. The evidence is overwhelming. López shows no remorse, no recognition of wrongdoing. He treats the proceedings with a mixture of boredom and pride. The judge delivers the sentence, 16 years in prison. The maximum allowed under Ecuadorian law, 16 years, for 110 confirmed victims, for confessions to hundreds more. Let's do the mathematics together. 110 victims, 16 years. That works out to approximately 53 days per victim. Less than 2 months per child whose life he ended. How is this possible? How does a man confess to crimes of this magnitude and receive what amounts to a slap on the wrist? The answer lies in a law passed over a century before Lopez was born. In the 1800s, Ecuador implemented a maximum sentence of 16 years for any crime, including the taking of life. The law was designed to protect military and political leaders during the frequent coups and regime changes of that era. It was meant to ensure that revolutionary leaders wouldn't face execution when the government inevitably changed hands again. No one anticipated that this law would one day protect a man like Lopez. The prosecutors could have charged Lopez with more crimes. They had evidence connecting him to potential cases in Colombia and Peru, but pursuing international prosecutions would be expensive, time-consuming, and bureaucratically complex. And ultimately, what would it accomplish? He was already receiving the maximum sentence Ecuador could impose, so they didn't pursue those cases. They let it rest at 110. Lopez understood exactly what this meant. In interviews conducted during his imprisonment, he would later boast, "I will soon be a free man again. They are releasing me on good behavior in 1998 or 99. He knew. From the moment of sentencing, he knew that his freedom was inevitable. Not possible, not likely, inevitable. Think about what that does to a person. To know that despite confessing to hundreds of deaths, despite showing no remorse, despite being potentially the most prolific individual criminal in modern history, you're going to walk free in less than 2 decades. What does that knowledge do to someone's sense of accountability, of consequences, of the value of human life? Lopez served his sentence at Garcia Moreno prison near Quito, one of Ecuador's most notorious facilities. His time there was not peaceful. Other inmates, many of whom were fathers themselves, attacked Lopez on multiple occasions. He was stabbed several times, requiring increased security measures to keep him alive. There's a bitter irony in that, the state protecting the life of a man who showed no such consideration for his victims. Throughout the early 1990s, as his release date approached, Lopez granted interviews to journalists. These conversations reveal a man utterly devoid of empathy, completely unable to recognize the humanity of those he harmed. In 1992, photojournalist Ron Leitner conducted one of the first major international interviews with Lopez in his cell. Leitner's account, later published in various true crime anthologies, painted a portrait of a man who spoke about his actions the way someone might discuss their job. Routine, mechanical, absent of emotion. When asked about the families of his victims, Lopez reportedly showed confusion, as if he'd never considered that the girls he targeted had parents, siblings, friends who mourned them. They were, to him, abstractions, objects in his personal narrative. This inability to recognize the humanity of others is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Lopez's psychology. It's one thing to commit terrible acts in rage or desperation. It's another thing entirely to commit them with the detached calculation of someone selecting fruit at a market. Psychologists who studied Lopez's case have debated his diagnosis for decades. Antisocial personality disorder is the most common conclusion. Others have suggested psychopathy, though that term lacks formal diagnostic criteria. What everyone agrees on is this: Lopez represented a fundamental danger to society, someone whose release would almost certainly result in additional harm. But Ecuador's laws were clear: 16 years maximum, with good behavior, and Lopez was very well behaved in prison when not being attacked by other inmates. He could be released even sooner. And so on August 31, 1994, after serving approximately 14 years, Pedro Alonso López walked out of prison a free man, 14 years, for confessions to over 300 victims. The prison's minister at the time, Pablo Figuero, acknowledged the absurdity in a statement to the press. "Yes, it does sound strange, but that is our law." Strange. That's the word he chose. Strange. But the story doesn't end with Lopez's release, because Ecuador, having no legal mechanism to keep him imprisoned, found another way. Immediately upon his release from prison, Lopez was arrested again, this time as an illegal immigrant. He was deported to Colombia, his country of birth. Colombian authorities were waiting. They had been monitoring the case, aware that one of history's worst criminals was about to become their problem. They attempted to charge Lopez with a case from 20 years prior, hoping to keep him incarcerated. But the evidence was insufficient. Too much time had passed. Witnesses were unavailable. The case fell apart. Instead, a judge made a different ruling. He declared Lopez insane and ordered him institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital in Bogotá. Finally, it seemed, someone was taking the threat seriously. If the law couldn't keep Lopez imprisoned, perhaps psychiatry could. For nearly 4 years, Lopez remained in the psychiatric facility. He was studied, evaluated, treated. The public largely forgot about him, assuming he would spend the rest of his life institutionalized. And then, in February 1998, the psychiatric facility made an announcement that shocked everyone following the case. Pedro Alonso López had been declared sane, not rehabilitated, not reformed, not showing genuine remorse or understanding of his actions. Just sane. The reasoning was never adequately explained. Perhaps the facility felt he no longer met the legal criteria for involuntary commitment. Perhaps there were financial pressures to free up beds. Perhaps it was simple bureaucratic indifference. Whatever the reason, López was released on bail equivalent to approximately $50 to $70. The conditions of his release required him to report periodically to authorities and attend psychiatric appointments. He posted bail, he walked out, and he never reported to anyone, ever again. Before vanishing, López did make one final documented visit to his elderly mother in El Espinal, Colombia. By this point, his mother was living in extreme poverty, barely surviving. López came asking for his inheritance. When he learned that his mother had nothing to give him, he sold her mattress, her chair, and what little furniture she possessed to street vendors. Then he left her with nothing and disappeared. That act, selling his own mother's belongings and abandoning her, might seem small compared to his other crimes, but it reveals something essential about López's character. Even the woman who gave him life meant nothing to him when she couldn't provide what he wanted. The last confirmed sighting of Pedro Alonso López occurred on September 22, 1999. He visited the National Civil Registry Office in Bogotá to renew his citizenship card, using false identity documents belonging to a 60-year-old man. After that, nothing. 26 years have passed since that day. 26 years of silence. In 2002, Colombian National Police and Interpol issued a warrant for López's arrest in connection with a case that bore similarities to his previous crimes. Authorities believed he might have resumed his activities, but the trail was cold. No one could locate him. Then in 2005, something extraordinary happened. Interpol deactivated the warrant. The reason? Colombia's National Institute of Forensic Medicine claimed that an unidentified body had been identified as López. But there was no confirmation, no family identification, no DNA match. Just a claim that was accepted without substantial corroboration. Many observers found this suspicious. Some theorized that Colombian authorities, frustrated by their inability to capture López and fearful of the negative publicity if he struck again, simply closed the case administratively, declared the problem solved and moved on. Others believe the body was genuinely López, that he died of natural causes or accident, and that the identification was legitimate even if poorly documented. Still others speculate something darker, that López was found by victims' families or by vigilantes who took justice into their own hands, executing him quietly to ensure he never harmed anyone again. The truth? We don't know. And that might be the most disturbing aspect of this entire case. Pedro Alonso López, confirmed responsible for 110 deaths and credibly suspected in hundreds more, simply vanished into the same obscurity from which he emerged. No final chapter, no confirmed ending, just silence. If he's alive today, he would be 76 years old, an old man, perhaps too frail to pose the same threat he once did, or perhaps still dangerous, still calculating, still watching for opportunity. If he's dead, then he died having served only 14 years for crimes that destroyed hundreds of families. He died having never paid a price proportional to the harm he caused. Either outcome is deeply unsatisfying. Because this case was never really about López himself. It was about what his story reveals about the world he operated in. Let me take you back to those borderlands between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru in the 1970s and 80s. This was a region in chaos, civil conflicts, political tensions, institutional weakness, government struggling with internal problems, with guerrilla movements, with poverty so deep it seemed insurmountable. In that chaos, borders were porous. Law enforcement cooperation between nations was minimal. A person could commit crimes in one country, flee to another, and effectively disappear. But more importantly, in that chaos, certain populations became invisible. The children Lopez targeted, street kids, indigenous girls, children from families so poor they didn't appear in official records. These were people society had already written off as expendable. Their disappearances were easy to rationalize, easy to attribute to trafficking or prostitution, or simply running away. Police had limited resources. When a middle-class child vanished, it might spark an investigation. When a poor indigenous girl vanished from a mountain village, it barely warranted a report. This is what allowed Lopez to operate with such impunity. He didn't choose victims randomly. He chose victims the system wouldn't miss. And when he was finally caught in Peru, caught red-handed by a community that understood the threat he posed, the state's response was to deport him, not investigate. Not prosecute, just make him someone else's problem. That decision cost approximately 200 lives in Ecuador. Think about that chain of causation. If Peruvian authorities had investigated Lopez when they had him in custody, if they had taken the indigenous community's concerns seriously, if they had looked into the pattern of missing girls in the region, the majority of his victims would still be alive. But they didn't, because the victims weren't important enough, because border deportation was cheaper than investigation, because systemic apathy is easier than systemic justice. Ecuador's legal framework represented another failure. A law designed over a century earlier to protect political leaders became the mechanism by which Lopez walked free. The 16-year maximum sentence was fundamentally inadequate for addressing a crime spree of this magnitude. Ecuador did eventually change this law. In 2008, they increased the maximum sentence to 25 years, then later to 40 years for specific aggravated circumstances. But these changes came far too late for Lopez's victims. And even now, even with longer sentences available, the core problem remains. No sentence length can undo the harm caused by someone like Lopez. No amount of imprisonment brings back the lives taken. Justice in these cases is always incomplete, but there's a difference between incomplete justice and no justice at all. Lopez received virtually no consequences proportional to his actions. He served 53 days per confirmed victim. He walked free after 14 years and was never captured again. That's not incomplete justice, that's justice denied. The psychiatric system's role in this case is perhaps the most frustrating. After Lopez's release from prison, Colombian authorities correctly identified him as a danger and institutionalized him. This was the right response, a man who shows no remorse for hundreds of crimes, who describes his actions with mechanical detachment, who explicitly states his intention to offend again. This is someone who requires indefinite commitment to protect public safety. But after 4 years, he was declared sane and released. The declaration of sanity in this context is almost meaningless. The question was never whether Lopez understood reality or whether he experienced delusions. The question was whether he posed a danger to others. And the answer to that question was unambiguously yes, yet he was released anyway, on bail equivalent to pocket change, with conditions he immediately violated, and no one stopped him. How does this happen? How does a system that recognizes a threat release that threat back into society? The answer again comes down to bureaucratic indifference and inadequate resources. Psychiatric facilities are expensive, beds are limited, and when space is needed, the patients who seem most functional are the first to be released. Lopez probably presented well. He was intelligent, articulate, capable of mimicking appropriate emotional responses when necessary. To staff members who saw him daily but didn't have access to his full criminal history, he might have seemed like just another patient who'd improved enough for discharge. But that improvement was superficial. The fundamental pathology, the inability to recognize others' humanity, the complete absence of empathy, remained unchanged. And so, he walked free. Again. The Interpol warrant's deactivation in 2005 represents the final failure in this cascade of institutional incompetence. When Lopez vanished after his 1998 release, when he failed to report to authorities or attend psychiatric appointments, when he used false documents to renew his identity card, the international law enforcement response should have been massive. This was a man linked to potentially 300 crimes across 3 nations. His recapture should have been a top priority for every agency involved. Instead, after a few years of unsuccessful searching, Interpol accepted an unverified claim that a body was Lopez's body and closed the case. No DNA confirmation, no family identification, just an administrative decision to stop looking. Some observers believe this was deliberate, that authorities, embarrassed by their inability to capture Lopez and fearful of the political consequences if he committed new crimes, chose to simply declare the problem solved. Others believe it was genuine error, that forensic officials made an honest mistake in identifying the body, that the information was passed along in good faith, that Interpol accepted it because they had no reason to doubt it. Either explanation is damning. Either we have authorities deliberately closing an active case for convenience, or we have a system so poorly coordinated that a critical identification error was accepted without verification. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you think happened to Lopez. Do you believe he's dead? Do you think he was eliminated by vigilantes? Do you think he's still out there, living under a false identity, an old man with memories that should terrify him but probably don't? I want to know what you think, because this case, it doesn't have an ending, and maybe we need to write one together, even if it's just speculation, even if we never get confirmation. So where does this leave us? What do we take away from the file of Pedro Alonso López? First, we must remember the victims. Over 100 confirmed, hundreds more suspected. Each one was a child. Each one had a name, though many of those names were never recorded. Each one had a family who waited for them to come home. Each one had dreams and fears and favorite foods and friends and everything that makes a person a person. They were not statistics. They were not abstractions. They were human beings whose lives were stolen, whose potential was destroyed, whose families were shattered. The names we know should be spoken. The names we don't know should be honored anyway. Second, we must recognize that this case represents systemic failure on every level. International law enforcement failed to coordinate. National governments failed to protect vulnerable populations. Legal systems failed to impose adequate consequences. Psychiatric institutions failed to maintain necessary commitments. And society as a whole failed to notice when hundreds of children disappeared because those children were poor, were indigenous, were already invisible. Lopez is responsible for his actions. Nothing in his background absolves him of that responsibility. But the scope of his crimes was enabled by systems that didn't care enough to stop him. Third, we must ask ourselves, how many others are operating right now in similar circumstances? How many predators target populations society has already written off? How many disappearances go uninvestigated because the victims don't matter enough to people in power? The answer is unknowable, but it's certainly more than zero. Lopez operated for years before capture. He was caught once in Peru and simply deported. He was arrested in Ecuador only because a brave mother intervened. If Carlina Poveda hadn't grabbed her daughter, if those market vendors hadn't responded to her cries, Lopez would have continued hunting. Luck. That's what stopped him, not good policing. Not effective border control, not a functioning justice system, just the luck of choosing the wrong target at the wrong time in the wrong place. How many others aren't caught because luck doesn't intervene? How many are operating in refugee camps, in slums, in failed states where law enforcement barely exists? We don't know. But we should be asking. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, we must grapple with the uncomfortable reality that justice in cases like this is impossible. No punishment fits the crime. No sentence makes things right. No amount of imprisonment brings anyone back or heals the trauma inflicted on families and communities. Lopez should have spent the rest of his life in prison. That much is clear. The 16-year maximum was grossly inadequate. But even if he'd received a sentence of life without parole, even if he'd died in prison as an old man, would that have been justice? The victims would still be gone. The families would still be devastated. The trauma would still echo through generations. This is the dark reality of criminal justice. Sometimes there are no good outcomes. Sometimes the damage is so profound that nothing can make it right. Sometimes all we can do is prevent further harm and honor the memory of those we lost. But Lopez's case doesn't even give us that much. because he was released, because he vanished, because the system that failed to stop him also failed to maintain any accountability for what he'd done. I want to take a moment to address something that makes this case particularly challenging to discuss. Throughout Lopez's interviews, throughout his confessions, throughout the entire documented history of his crimes, one thing stands out: his complete lack of remorse. When most people commit terrible acts, even hardened criminals, there's usually some recognition, however small, of the wrongness of their actions. Maybe they justify it. Maybe they blame circumstances. Maybe they claim they had no choice. But somewhere in their narrative, there's an acknowledgement that what they did violated some moral code. Lopez showed none of that. In his interviews, he spoke about his actions the way a carpenter might describe building furniture. There was technique, there was method, there was even a kind of pride in his efficiency. But there was no recognition that he had destroyed lives, that he had caused immeasurable suffering, that his victims were human beings who mattered. When asked about the families, he seemed genuinely puzzled by the question, as if he'd never considered that the girls he targeted had mothers and fathers and siblings who loved them, as if their lives only existed in relation to him, and once he'd taken what he wanted, they simply ceased to be. This kind of pathology is rare. Even among serial offenders, most show some capacity for recognition of others' humanity, even if they override it in the moment of their crimes. But Lopez seemed to lack that capacity entirely. Psychologists have struggled to categorize this kind of mindset. Some call it extreme antisocial personality disorder. Others use the term psychopathy, though that's not an official diagnosis. What everyone agrees on is that Lopez represented a fundamental break from normal human moral development. He wasn't someone who knew right from wrong and chose wrong anyway. He was someone for whom the entire concept of right and wrong, at least as it applied to his victims, simply didn't exist. This makes rehabilitation impossible. You can't teach someone to value human life if they're fundamentally incapable of recognizing that other people are fully real. You can't instill empathy in someone who lacks the neural architecture to experience it. This is why Lopez's release was not just a failure of law, but a failure of understanding. The system treated him as if he was someone who had committed crimes but could potentially be reformed. In reality, he was someone for whom reform wasn't possible, because the thing that needed reforming, his capacity to recognize others' humanity, didn't exist. Let me paint you a picture of what life was like in those border regions during Lopez's active years. Imagine a marketplace in a small Ecuadorian mountain town. It's early morning. Vendors are setting up stalls with vegetables, textiles, pottery. The air smells of cooking fires and fresh bread. Children weave through the crowds, running errands for their parents or just playing. Most of these children are safe. Most of them will go home at the end of the day, eat dinner with their families, go to sleep in their own beds. But some of them, the ones whose clothes are more worn, whose faces show signs of malnutrition, whose families can barely afford to feed them, these children are living on a razor's edge. They're vulnerable in ways that wealthier children aren't. They're more likely to talk to strangers who offer food. They're more likely to trust promises of work or money. They're more likely to wander away from safety because they've learned that safety is a luxury they can't always afford. And someone like Lopez knows how to identify these children. He knows how to spot the vulnerability. He knows exactly what to say, what to offer, how to position himself as trustworthy. This is the hunting ground. A marketplace that looks vibrant and full of life to the casual observer is, to a predator, a target-rich environment where the most vulnerable are marked as clearly as if they wore signs. And when one of these children disappears, when they don't come home that night, the response from authorities is often minimal. The family files a report, if they file one at all. The police take notes, add it to a pile of similar reports and move on. There's no media coverage, no public outcry, no political pressure to solve the case. The child just vanishes, becomes another missing person statistic, another name in a ledger that no one reads. This is what Lopez exploited. Not just the vulnerability of individual children, but the vulnerability of entire communities that existed outside the protection of effective law enforcement. Now imagine the same scene, but years later. After Lopez has been caught, after the graves have been found, after the scope of his crimes has been revealed. Those same marketplaces are different now. Parents hold their children's hands tighter. Vendors watch strangers more carefully. There's a wariness that wasn't there before, or rather, a wariness that was always there but is now validated, now recognized as necessary rather than paranoid. The mothers and fathers who lost daughters to Lopez, those who know what happened, who identified remains, who received that devastating confirmation, they live in a special kind of hell. They replay the last day they saw their child. They wonder if they could have done something different. They rage against the authorities who didn't investigate when their daughter first disappeared. They grapple with the knowledge that the man who took their child served less than 15 years and then walked free. How do you process that? How do you find peace with a system that valued your daughter's life at approximately 50 days of incarceration? You can't. There is no peace to be found there, only anger, only grief, only the slow erosion of faith in institutions and justice, and the idea that the world is fundamentally fair. And the families who never got confirmation, whose daughters disappeared during Lopez's active years, who never found remains, who never got closure, they live with something even worse: uncertainty. The terrible hope that maybe their daughter is still alive somewhere, trafficked but alive. Suffering but survivable. The equally terrible fear that she's dead, that she suffered, that they'll never know what happened or where she is. Lopez created hundreds of these stories, hundreds of families suspended in permanent grief, permanent uncertainty, permanent rage. And then he vanished, leaving them without even the cold comfort of knowing he's definitely imprisoned or definitely deceased. Guys, if you've made it this far into this video, if you're still listening at the, what are we at now, 45 minutes, 50? Then you understand something important. You understand that these stories matter. That bearing witness to these failures, these tragedies, these moments where humanity shows its absolute worst, is itself a kind of activism. So do me a favor, share this video. Send it to someone who needs to understand how systems fail vulnerable populations. Send it to someone studying criminal justice or social work or international law. Send it to someone who thinks these kinds of cases don't happen anymore, who believes that modern systems are too sophisticated to let predators operate with this kind of impunity. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Cases like Lopez's are still happening. Maybe not at the same scale. Maybe not with the same body count. But somewhere in the world right now, there are vulnerable populations being targeted by predators, and systems are failing to protect them. We honor the victims by refusing to look away, by demanding better, by remembering their names when we know them, and honoring their memory when we don't. Hit that like button if this video affected you. We're trying to reach 50 likes. I know it's a small number, but for a channel just starting out, it means the world. It tells me you're paying attention. It tells me these stories matter to you too. So what theories exist about what happened to Lopez after 1999? Let me walk you through the main possibilities, because this is where speculation becomes necessary. We're in the realm of educated guesses and circumstantial reasoning. Theory 1. Natural death. Lopez would be 76 years old today. He had a history of substance abuse, particularly bazuco in his youth. He lived rough for many years. It's entirely possible that he died of natural causes: heart disease, stroke, cancer, any of the things that claim lives in their 70s. His body could have been found, misidentified or unidentified, and buried or cremated without anyone connecting it to the wanted fugitive. In a country like Colombia, with millions of people and imperfect records, this isn't implausible. Bodies are found regularly that are never identified. If Lopez died in a remote area, or if he was using a false identity at the time of death, the connection might never have been made. Theory 2. Vigilante execution. This is the theory that many people find most satisfying emotionally, even if there's no evidence for it. The idea is that families of victims or community members who knew what Lopez had done tracked him down after his release and took justice into their own hands. Perhaps they executed him quietly, disposed of the body where it would never be found, and maintained silence about what they'd done. It's dramatic. It's poetic. It feels like the justice the system failed to provide, but there's no evidence this happened, no rumors, no whispers, no deathbed confessions. Just wishful thinking from people who want to believe evil was punished. Theory 3. Government cover-up. Some theorists believe that Colombian or Ecuadorian authorities located Lopez at some point after his disappearance, determined that he posed too much of a political liability if he were to commit new crimes, and eliminated him quietly. Then they manufactured the story about the unidentified body being his as a way to close the case administratively. This theory requires us to believe that government officials would commit extrajudicial execution and coordinate a cover-up. Not impossible, especially in countries with histories of such activities, but also not supported by any concrete evidence. Theory 4. New identity. Perhaps Lopez is still alive, living under a false identity somewhere in South America or beyond. This theory suggests that he had the discipline and resources to disappear completely, to maintain a low profile for over 25 years, to never draw attention to himself or engage in activities that would bring him to police notice. Given what we know about Lopez's personality, his arrogance, his lack of impulse control, his need for recognition, this seems unlikely, but not impossible. Theory 5. Continued criminal activity unreported. The darkest theory is that Lopez resumed his activities after his release, but did so in ways that avoided detection. Perhaps he moved to even more remote areas. Perhaps he targeted populations even more vulnerable than before. Perhaps he learned from his capture and adapted his methods. This theory is terrifying because it suggests that somewhere victims' families might be experiencing the same grief as those in Ecuador and Peru and Colombia, but without even knowing the name of the man responsible. Which theory is correct, we don't know. We may never know. And that uncertainty is itself a kind of ongoing trauma for everyone affected by Lopez's crimes. Let me tell you about one of the Ecuadorian investigators who worked on the Lopez case. His name appears in various reports, but I'll respect his privacy by not using it here. What matters is what he said in an interview years after the case concluded. This investigator described the experience of excavating those graves near Ambato. He described how each discovery felt like a punch to the gut, how they started each day hoping they wouldn't find more remains, and how they always did. How he went home each night and hugged his own daughters tighter, unable to shake the images from his mind. He described Lopez's demeanor during the searches, how casual he was, how he pointed out locations the way someone might point out landmarks on a tour, how he showed no emotion when the remains were uncovered, no recognition that these were children, were people, were someone's beloved daughter. And this investigator said something that has stayed with me since I first read it. He said, "I've worked on many cases. I've seen terrible things. But Lopez was different. When you look into the eyes of most criminals, you see something human, even if it's twisted. When I looked at Lopez, I saw nothing. Just emptiness." That emptiness is what makes this case so deeply disturbing. We want to understand evil. We want to trace its origins, find its causes, believe that if we can understand it, we can prevent it. But sometimes evil isn't complex. Sometimes it's not the result of intricate psychological processes or sociological factors. Sometimes it's just absence. An absence of empathy, an absence of recognition of others' humanity, an absence of the thing that makes most of us incapable of harming innocence. You can't rehabilitate absence. You can't teach someone to have what fundamentally isn't there. This is why Lopez should never have been released, not because punishment would undo his crimes, not because vengeance serves justice, but because someone with that level of pathology, that fundamental absence of human connection, will always pose a danger to others. The system failed to recognize this, and that failure may have cost additional lives. I want to talk for a moment about Carlina Poveda, the mother who saved her daughter Maria Romana in that marketplace in Ambato, because in a story this dark, she represents something important, the power of vigilance, of intuition, of a mother's protective instinct. Carlina didn't know who Lopez was when she saw him approaching her daughter. She didn't know his history. She just knew something felt wrong. Maybe it was the way he looked at Maria. Maybe it was the way he positioned himself. Maybe it was pure maternal instinct. Whatever it was, she acted. She didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess herself. She grabbed her daughter and she shouted for help. In doing so, she ended one of the most prolific crime sprees in history. Think about that. Not international law enforcement cooperation, not sophisticated detective work, not forensic science or criminal profiling. One mother's vigilance and willingness to make a scene in a public marketplace. Carlina Poveda saved her daughter's life, and she saved the lives of every girl who would have come after Maria if Lopez hadn't been stopped that day. She deserves to be remembered not just as the mother of a target, but as the person who finally stopped a monster. Now let's talk about the broader implications of this case for how we think about criminal justice and public safety. The Lopez case challenges several comfortable assumptions we hold about justice systems. We like to believe that the severity of a crime will be matched by the severity of its punishment. We like to believe that dangerous individuals will be identified and kept away from society. We like to believe that international cooperation will prevent criminals from exploiting borders. Lopez's case demolishes all of these beliefs. A man confirmed responsible for 110 deaths and credibly suspected in hundreds more, served 14 years. Not because anyone thought that was appropriate, not because anyone believed justice had been served, but because a law designed for an entirely different purpose happened to limit the maximum sentence. This is bureaucracy at its most destructive. Rules applied without consideration of context or consequence. The letter of the law elevated above its spirit or purpose. And when Ecuador released Lopez after his sentence was complete, when Colombia tried and failed to keep him imprisoned on new charges, when the psychiatric institution declared him sane and released him, each of these was a system following its internal logic while failing catastrophically at its broader purpose of protecting society. This is the danger of treating justice as a purely procedural matter. Procedures are important. Due process matters. But when procedures lead to outcomes that obviously violate the purpose those procedures were designed to serve, something is fundamentally broken. Let me tell you what keeps me awake about this case. It's not the crimes themselves, as horrific as they were. It's not even Lopez's lack of remorse or the pathology he displayed. It's the certainty that this is still happening. Somewhere in the world right now, there are vulnerable populations. Refugees, street children, indigenous communities, people living in failed states or conflict zones who are being targeted by predators. And those predators are operating with relative impunity because the systems meant to protect these populations are overwhelmed, underfunded, corrupt, or simply indifferent. Lopez exploited the border chaos between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru in the 70s and 80s. But that kind of chaos exists in dozens of places today. The Syrian refugee crisis, the collapse of state authority in parts of Libya and Somalia, the gang-controlled regions of Central America, the internally displaced populations in Myanmar, in South Sudan, in Yemen. In all of these places, children are vulnerable. And wherever children are vulnerable, predators will emerge to exploit that vulnerability. We can't stop all of them. The world is too large, too chaotic, too broken in too many places. But we can refuse to look away. We can demand that institutions do better. We can insist that vulnerable populations matter, that their safety is a priority, that their disappearances warrant investigation. This is what bearing witness means, not just learning about past failures, but using that knowledge to demand better in the present. Before we close this file, I want to return to the victims one more time. Because in a story dominated by the figure of the perpetrator, by the systems that failed, by the theories about what happened to him, it's easy to lose sight of why any of this matters. Each girl Lopez targeted was a universe unto herself. She had favorite games, she had friends, she had dreams about what she might become when she grew up. Maybe she wanted to be a teacher, maybe a mother. Maybe she wanted to travel, to see the ocean, to learn to read, to own a dress that wasn't handed down. She had fears too. Maybe she was afraid of the dark. Maybe she worried about her family's poverty. Maybe she felt scared when strangers approached her, but didn't know how to say no to offers of food or money, because saying no might mean going hungry that night. She was someone, not a statistic, not an abstraction, not a victim defined solely by what was done to her. She was a full person, and she deserved a full life. And because we don't know most of their names, because they were invisible to society before they disappeared and remained invisible after, we have an obligation to remember them collectively. To say, these children mattered, their lives had value. Their deaths represent not just individual tragedies, but collective failures. So where does that leave us? What do we do with a story like this? We can't bring back the victims. We can't undo the failures of police and prosecutors and politicians. We can't change Ecuador's laws retroactively or keep Lopez imprisoned after his release. We can't even confirm whether he's alive or dead. But we can remember, we can bear witness, we can refuse to let these stories disappear into obscurity. And maybe, just maybe, we can use these failures to demand better, to insist that vulnerable populations deserve protection, to push for international cooperation on transnational crimes, to challenge legal systems that prioritize procedure over purpose, to fund the institutions that work with at-risk children, and to support the communities where these children live. None of that brings back the dead, but it might prevent some future deaths. And in the face of horror, this profound prevention is the only meaningful response we have. The file on Pedro Alonso López remains technically open. Despite the deactivation of his Interpol warrant, despite the claims of his death, there's no definitive closure. He exists in a state of perpetual uncertainty, possibly deceased, possibly alive, possibly operating under a new identity somewhere in the world. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps a case built on so many failures, so many uncertainties, so many moments where the system could have acted differently and didn't, deserves an uncertain ending. But I'll tell you what I believe. I believe Lopez is dead. I believe he died years ago, probably of natural causes, probably in obscurity, probably without anyone knowing who he really was. I believe the Colombian authorities' claim about identifying his remains, even if poorly documented, was probably accurate. I believe this not because I have evidence, but because the alternative, that he's alive, that he lived free for 25 years after serving only 14 years for hundreds of crimes, is too much to bear. So I choose to believe he's dead, but I don't know, none of us know. And that uncertainty is itself a kind of ongoing violence against the families who lost daughters to him, who deserve to know with certainty that he could never hurt anyone else. It's late now. We've been here together for nearly an hour, sitting in the darkness of this story, examining every angle of a case that represents humanity at its worst and systems at their most broken. If you're still with me, thank you. Thank you for not looking away. Thank you for bearing witness. Thank you for believing that these stories matter enough to deserve an hour of your time. The Midnight File exists because I believe we have an obligation to remember the forgotten, to shine light into the corners of history that society would prefer to ignore, to ask hard questions about systems and justice and why we let some people's suffering disappear while other people's suffering dominates headlines. Subscribe if you believe that too. Join this community of people who refuse to look away, who want to understand the darkness, not to revel in it, but to prevent it. We're small right now, just getting started, but every subscriber tells me this work matters. And leave me that comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you think happened to Lopez. Tell me whether stories like this change how you see the world. Because here's the thing about cases like this. They should change us. They should make us more vigilant, more compassionate toward vulnerable populations, more demanding of the institutions that are supposed to protect us. If you walk away from this story unchanged, then I haven't done my job. The girls whose lives were stolen by Pedro Alonso López deserved better. They deserved systems that noticed when they disappeared. They deserved police who investigated thoroughly. They deserved prosecutors who pursued every possible charge. They deserved a legal framework that protected them even after their deaths by ensuring their attacker faced consequences proportional to his crimes. They didn't get any of that. What they got was shallow graves in the Andean foothills, brief mentions in police reports, mothers who waited for them to come home, and fathers who searched until exhaustion forced them to stop. Communities that mourned quietly because grief was common there, because loss was ordinary, because there were so many reasons a child might disappear and no resources to investigate them all. What they got was a predator who confessed to ending their lives and then walked free after 14 years. That's not justice, that's not closure. That's not even acknowledgement of the value of their lives. It's just failure. Pure, systemic, multi-layered failure. And the only way we honor them now is by refusing to let that failure be forgotten. By telling their story, even when we don't know their names. By demanding that future systems do better. By insisting that vulnerable populations deserve protection equal to what we demand for our own children. Every town keeps a secret. Some just bury it deeper than others. The towns where Lopez operated, those marketplaces in Ambato and mountain villages in Peru and street corners in Bogotá, they carry secrets in their soil, shallow graves that were found, others that probably remain undiscovered, places where children vanished and were never seen again. The people who live there remember, even if they don't speak about it, even if younger generations don't know the full story. There's a collective memory in places like that, a wariness that gets passed down without anyone explicitly teaching it. Don't talk to strangers. Don't wander alone. Don't trust easy promises. These are lessons learned in blood, written in the absence of children who should have grown up to have children of their own. And somewhere, whether in a forgotten grave or still walking free, Pedro Alonso López represents the monster those lessons were designed to protect against. But he also represents something larger. He represents what happens when systems fail, when borders are porous, when law enforcement lacks resources or political will, when vulnerable populations are expendable in the eyes of those with power. He represents the cost of apathy, and that cost is measured in hundreds of lives that were barely noticed when they disappeared and barely remembered after they were gone. If you made it to the end of this video, if you sat through this entire hour, then you understand something important about the kind of content we're building here at the Midnight File. This isn't entertainment. This isn't sensationalism. This is witness-bearing. This is remembering. This is holding up mirrors to the darkness and refusing to look away. Hit that subscribe button one more time if you haven't already. We need to reach 100 subscribers, and every single one matters. Every subscription tells YouTube's algorithm that this content deserves to be seen, that these stories deserve to be told, that the victims deserve to be remembered. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how systems fail vulnerable populations. Share it with someone studying law or criminal justice or social work. Share it with someone who believes that cases like this don't happen anymore. Because they do happen, just in different forms, in different places. And the only way we prevent them is by learning from the past, by demanding better from our institutions, by refusing to let vulnerable populations remain invisible. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about stories that most people would rather forget. The next file may be darker still, but we'll face it together. Until then, this is Julian Cross, signing off from the Midnight File. Sleep well if you can.